Hi everybody, how are you? Everyone enjoying their day so far? They were going to do somebody who would introduce me, and then somebody would introduce somebody, and then that somebody would introduce me, and then I'd introduce them. We decided to do away with all that, and I'm just going to introduce them. My name is Dorobek. I am the former editor of Federal Computer Week. I was the afternoon do on Federal News Radio for a couple years, and now I'm with an outfit called GovLoop. People know GovLoop. Please know GovLoop. Yeah, this is where you nod your heads and say, oh, it's just so awesome. GovLoop is a great organization. We have 100,000 government people who are working on my favorite 6 words: help government do its job better. We were just talking up here. Does anyone have one of these evolution things?
Yes, and I love them.
They're horrible. They are unedible.
That's actually supposed to be an intravenous feed.
Oh, no, please. So we're talking about something, the title is called Being an Acquisition Superhero, Your Role in Protecting the Nation's Cyber Infrastructure. And it sounds so important. I'm going to take this off because I've already introduced myself. And we are actually going to be talking about stuff that I think most of you, if you've heard of, you don't know nearly enough about, because it's coming and it's really important, and so we're going to get you informed about what it is. And so how we're going to work things is we're going to spend a third of our time, probably a little less than that, sort of describing why we're here talking about this stuff in the first place. You may have heard cybersecurity is more important these days than ever before, and we're going to talk about why. Then we'll spend a third talking about these new rules, which just came out a couple weeks ago.
The recommendations.
Yeah, draft recommendations. I'm sorry.
That's okay. Rules are bad. He's going to
Everyone freaks out when you use the R word.
Now that I have your attention.
Yes. They came out, what, 2 weeks ago? 3 weeks ago?
End of January.
End of January. And then we're going to, we're going to open it up. As always with these things, if you have a question, don't wait and hold it till the end. Just catch my eye, and I'll be floating around, and we'll talk about it. And it's a good time to do that. So let's kick it off here and start with Joe. Joe, they gave me all easy names to pronounce because I'm so agile and good at this. Joe Jarzombek, oh, there you go, is Director for Software and Supply Chain Assurance for the Department of Homeland Security's Stakeholder Engagement in Cyber Infrastructure, and he fits all of that on one business card. It's a business card not this big, but it fits. So talk a little bit about the program. Why are we even talking about these don't call them rules? What's the issue that folks are dealing with?
So within the Office of Cybersecurity Communications, we have this broad reach with dealing with the stakeholder community. You may have heard of this little thing called a cybersecurity framework that's come out. And we have a C-Cube, there's a whole voluntary program that goes with that. But there's an understanding that says, if you don't understand why you need this, why would you adopt something like that? And how would you leverage that? So I did bring some slides only just as stage setting perspective, because we focus
awesome photo there, Joe.
on enabling enterprise resilience through security automation, software assurance, and supply chain risk management. And it focuses on our information and communications technologies roles that we have. And in particular, I leave behind the typical, this is our mission, why we do that, but it really comes down to we're responsible, and I almost smile when I say this, because I came out of the Department of Defense, and the Department of Defense has a lot of big challenges on what they acquire, the whole issue of cybersecurity issues, but at least the Department of Defense owns and operates everything they have. The Department of Homeland Security has been tasked to work with the critical infrastructure to make sure it's secure and resilient, yet we don't own and operate it. And so collaboration is the name of the game, and how we do that. And the way we do this is we focus on what is it that we care about in our critical infrastructure. And everybody knows about the big assets, all the way from plants to telecommunications, but it really comes down to they're enabled through the information communications technology. And what we're finding, and this is pervasive, it's not just within the federal government, but those who run our nation's critical infrastructure, they are now put at risk because of the software that either runs and enables it, and counterfeit products that are now coming in and putting our citizens at risk. Across the board, we're finding issues there. And so we run a forum. This is a public-private collaboration forum that I run with the Department of Defense, DHS, and NIST. And in fact, it's going on right now. I jumped out of that to come over here. And it is a public-private collaboration. Industry comes into this, other federal agencies, to work these problems. And I'll address what some of those problems are. It comes down to the fact that we have an increased risk from our supply chain. And that supply chain is, we buy hardware, software, components, services. And we know that we have an increasing dependence upon the global supply chain. In fact, this is not going to go away. It is global. This idea is to bring it back to the United States, we're going to fix it. There are some things that domestically you can deal with the risk management, but it is a global economy to be able to do that. But because of that, we have varying levels of development and outsourcing controls. When we talk about these controls, and this comes into the acquisition community as well as the development community, there are security controls that you can put in place either through contracts, through how you control your development life cycle, how you operate systems. And actually they're well articulated within this Special Pub 853, Rep 4 is out right now. And those security controls are there, and it's very important. It's a matter of picking which ones are applicable to you. But you know, we found out some of that, they needed better guidance. So coming out in about 2 weeks, you're going to see NIST Special Pub 161 that deals with supply chain practices. That takes advantage of the other NIST Special Pubs in this space, but specifically looks at what security controls you put in place. And that's going to be very important because it's what everyone, not just the federal government, what we use, but applicable to everyone. We have a lack of transparencies for the process chain of custody. Quite frankly, when you buy something, do you really know where it came from? You can say, well, I bought it from this individual, but do you really understand the supply chain associated with it? And we have varying levels of acquisition due diligence. And in fact, some cases we have none. Basically, I bought a thing, it was on the GSA schedule. Well, where did it come from? It's, you know, we didn't check it. And one of the terms that we're going to use here is just because it's available, is it fit for use for your environment? Fitness for use is going to be a key criteria for us. We move forward with the acquisition guidance that we have with it. We'll come back to that. We have, and the reason we care about all this is because many people will refer to it as a technical debt, but it's residual risk that moves forward through the supply chain that we in the enterprise are inheriting. We inherit it without even knowing that we've got it. And that risk is due to counterfeit products that we bring into our enterprise, and more significantly, even if they're authentic products, both counterfeit and authentic products can be tainted. And what we mean by that is they can have malicious software in there, exploitable weaknesses, and vulnerabilities. And it's something that we're really not doing as good of a job as we could. Some agencies do better than others at checking that. Some within the critical infrastructure do a better job. And we know that we, right now, because of the growing sophistication of those who wish to do something to us, they can easily get in, not only penetrate our existing operational networks, but it turns out that a favorite attack vector is the supply chain. Why go through guns, gates, and guards and your DMZs and your firewalls when you can simply attack your suppliers and you can attack their supply processes and therefore literally modify and do things to the products as they traverse through that supply chain. And it's a really big issue, by the way. And because you think, oh, we're just dealing with it locally here, it's not. The global supply chain, all the touch points that you understand. Now, the Department of Homeland Security actually can help in those touch points because through ICE and CBP, we have people at foreign ports that are actually supporting some of these activities. And why do we care? And if you say, well, I'm just an acquisition guy, or I'm just a contracting officer, why does this matter to me? For you see, everyone does risk management. You can probably say the same words in your sleep overnight. Everybody focuses on cost, schedule, and performance, right? That's how we do. But you know, this is very dependent upon where you stand. For you see, at the enterprise level, we actually focus on a changing threat environment. We have to make a business case. But we turn to projects or programs to deliver those capabilities. And when you only focus on cost, schedule, and performance, and usually performance means what's on contract, are we really addressing the needs of the enterprise? And so we've recognized that there are people making risk decisions for us along that way. There are suppliers making risk decisions. See, they're managing business risk, but are they managing the risk that goes on to the supplier? Actually, yesterday we had an entire session at our forum just on that, and it was all on industry, on what they do to mitigate risks, so how they measure it, and how do they communicate risk, both internally within their organization and to their customers. Because this needs to become a dialogue. You will never be 100% secure, even for you trying to do that. So it's how do you develop this dialogue between the acquiring and the supplying organizations? Again, the work that Emile's going to be talking about, we intend to do that. The intention of NIST 800-161 is that you have these security controls that you actually engage the suppliers. so that it's a dialogue. You have pre-solicitation activities to be able to do that. So we're finding out that people are making risk decisions for us along the way, and we're often uninformed. I can come back to this later, but this is how we've structured our program to be able to do that. And the reason is we actually put out a lot of resources to the community. We make them available online. We make it available unclassified. We support other agencies. If you've got issues, even what's the risk associated with either products or suppliers, we'll talk about. We'll never get into, should I buy this, should I deal with them? We don't do that. We just talk about risks that are associated with it. We spend the majority of our program dollars in security automation. Again, a whole other session to be able to, if you're going to bring this to scale, you've got to be able to automate that. So we can talk about what some of those solutions are later on. But it is a huge problem, and it's not something that you have to keep within the classified environment. There are a lot of aspects that we need to do that. But if we're really going to make this so that people can address that, we have to get into our workforce education and training. We have to provide the training. Emile and I have already been working on, both within DHS, but federal government-wide, how do we develop training programs, what goes into that for our acquisition officers, our procurement officers, and our contracting officers. So I'll leave it with that and come back later.
Perfect. John Pistolessi, I said it right before.
You said it right the first time.
Pistolessi.
And then you
Right, and now I just, he's with the Defense Intelligence Agency, right, DIA, the Supply Chain Risk Management Program. He's a program manager for supply chain. Other than that, I got the title perfectly right. Talk a little bit and jump up a level for me. Why is this, what's keeping us up at night that we're really worried about? Have we seen this kind of people attack in this kind of way, or is this, we're worried, we're seeing it coming?
Well, let's see. We can go back here a few years, and if you pay attention in the news, you will see little snippets of this kind of stuff coming up all the time. But I can take you back to in 2010, there was a Department of Commerce report that came out that talked about the counterfeit, the growing counterfeit problem, and how the counterfeits went from 3,369 incidents in 2005 up to 8,644 in 2008. And no sign of abatement. I mean, the curve keeps going up. So we're relatively certain that counterfeits aren't going away, and that's kind of a way of life in the global market. And then, of course, this doesn't just apply. I'm particularly concerned about IT, but this applies across all industries. I mean, you can go buy a counterfeit, Coach purse or anything. A couple of years ago, there was a Senate Armed Service Committee investigation that looked at the Department of Defense supply chain that found 1,800 cases involving more than 1 million parts, including parts of the Missile Defense Agency THAAD interceptor that cost, I think, upwards of $4 to $5 million to go back and correct that. A couple of years ago, there was a HPSI, House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence investigation that basically called out a couple of Chinese companies, Huawei and ZTE, as posing a threat to U.S. national security interests. And you can go online and I won't dwell on these, but you can go online and read all about these. And then, just in the last year or so, the legislation has been passed for NASA, Department of Justice, Department of Commerce, and the National Science Foundation that basically says that they can't go out and purchase IT equipment that's been made by a Chinese government subsidized company without getting a report from the FBI on whether that procurement would pose a cyber espionage or cyber threat risk. Okay, so I say all that by way of kind of giving you kind of the environment and the landscape, over the last 6-8 years or so, beginning primarily with the CNCI, the Comprehensive National Cybersecurity Initiative, leading to various pieces of legislation that have come out. So we've gotten presidential direction, we've gotten whole of government kinds of guidance and direction. We've gotten as a DoD agency guy, I've gotten several pieces of instructions and guidance, and basically it all funnels down to the idea that we need to protect our supply chain, and in order to do that, we need to make a risk-based management decision on all of our procurements of mission-critical systems before we go out and buy those.
And again, part of the idea here, as Joe mentioned, folks are saying it's too hard to just attack, even cyber attack systems. This may be an easier way in, right? That's part of the fear and danger.
Yeah, one of our key things is that in order to get to a hard to target kind of system or network, supply chain attack might be the best method.
Don Johnson is, by the way, did you know, apparently, when I Googled you, there was another guy who has that name. I had no idea. He wore these bright colors and no socks. I guess he couldn't afford socks. I don't know what the deal was. John Johnson is with the Department of Defense Acquisition Technology and Logistics. I think most acquisition people hear somebody talk about cybersecurity and they go, well, that's clearly not my job. Connect cyber and, oh, my pocket's going off. Connect cyber and acquisition. What's the connection here?
So I would describe it simply put that we are entering a new era where every federal acquisition is going to have a cyber component in it. Hasn't been before, it's happening now, and it's going to happen more so in the future. It's just going to scale up in terms of the degree of change that's going to happen, and I don't care if you're doing DoD, NIH, across the board, we are entering an era where cybersecurity requirements are going to be part and parcel, core pieces of the proposal, the ask, as well as the potential of not awarding the contractor based upon the supply chain risk, without even telling the contractor why we chose not to go with them. That's already in the FAR, as we have it today. So back to your point, we're entering a new era, kind of like a new space era. We're entering a new cyber era. It's been around for a long time. Now, organizations are moving out on it. In DoD, we're certainly moving out. We have DFARs we've already published. We have migrated to a risk management framework. Years and years we had this certification called DICAP. It's gone. Last week we implemented a new RMF framework, risk management framework for DoD. We have implemented a guidebook for program managers. So back to your point, the world is changing when it comes to cybersecurity for the entire federal government.
And the impact on, and in fact, we wanted to ask, how many government people in the room? Thank you, thank you, thank you. And other industry, I guess is the rest of you, right? Just raise your hand so I can make sure you're alive. A couple people, the rest of them are dead. So for the acquisition folks, what is this going to mean for them? Are they going to have to, what changes?
Well, so as we go forward, and I would describe it as, we got to think of this as not agency by agency. This is an effort that began with the executive order last February by the president, with a recommendation for a report to be developed. Partnered with GSA and DoD to go back with recommendations. We submitted a report and published, as we highlighted earlier, 7 recommendations back. So as we go forward, for that program manager and for that contracting officer, or on the other side, for that proposal team that's receiving, is you're going to have to look very carefully at how the cybersecurity requirements are. For example, years ago, my last proposal when I was in industry was something in the National Counterterrorism Center, in essence the IT system of it. I had a big piece of the proposal. I was the software architect for the proposal. We knocked out the big guns. I described a Northrop and Lockheed, knocked them out in the shoot final. I don't remember, as the industry team, I don't remember cybersecurity as part of my proposal. Those days are gone. Those days are completely gone. So back to the industry team, it's back to, you gotta be thinking very carefully, in terms of innovation, in terms of where the government is going when it comes to your proposal.
Yeah.
And both of these comments here, because there's some concern about where does it come from and stuff like that. But you understand, if you don't understand how your suppliers manage their risk, what process and practices they have, just simply making it US doesn't fix it. But the bigger issue from an acquisition perspective, we're moving more and more to cloud services in general. We're buying services. But you got to ask yourself, what are these services implemented in? Hardware, software. You know, there's work that goes with that, but a big piece of it is hardware and software. And if people were not worrying about the supply chain risk when we were actually purchasing software and hardware, what's the likelihood they're going to be looking at these cybersecurity risks when we're buying services? It's kind of concerning.
And Emile has been so good at sitting there so patiently.
I had to say something.
Yes, sorry. Emile Monette, right? Monette is the Senior Advisor for Cybersecurity in GSA's Office of Mission Assurance. So that brings us to these new guidance, draft, whatever we're calling them.
Things that aren't rules.
Yes, no, don't call them rules. And by the way, I pulled them all together if you go to my Twitter feed, twitter.com/cdorobek, the top post is links to, and I pulled them all together so you can find them nice and easy. But talk a little bit about what these, first step back and talk about why they came about, and then get into what they are.
Sure. So I always start out talking about this, much like my esteemed panelists here we have a common problem here. It's a shared problem. It's not just a government problem. It's not just an industry problem. Who shopped at Target on Black Friday? Right? Oh, I guess it's all of our problem. And who knows how that breach happened? Well, the bad actor got into our point of sale thing where you swipe your credit card and they stole it through the refrigerator, through the HVAC contractor, who was managing the temperatures in the refrigeration systems remotely. And those credentials were lost and then stolen or whatever. And that bad actor got in and was able to, give us all a free credit monitoring. That connection to...
And by the way, the former CIO of Target is...
Well, people lost their job, as a former. And to that individual's credit, I don't know exactly where it happened, but I believe some of the things I've read that those information security people made the case to management prior to this happening that there was a vulnerability there. And the risk decision was made to let it go. Looking back, probably not the best decision. But, depending on what the resource investment is on the front end in a government environment that we have now where we have to make very tough budget decisions. The very first response that I'm going to get if I walk up to a program manager or budget owner and say, well, you're buying widget XYZ and that's high risk, so therefore you now need to do these 18 things, and yes, by the way, they all cost money. The very first answer I get is, well, I'm different. Right? The second answer I get is, you're wrong. And so as we implement these recommendations, we're really trying to take it from the bottom up and crawl, walk, run. And I mean, we have a request for comment out right now, and we're looking for comments on taxonomy. Can we even say the same word and understand what we all mean by it? And then once we get to that, and my buzzword for any of this, because it's tough to get to perfect, my buzzword is imperfect. Let's do something, let's agree on something, acknowledge the flaws, address them if we can, and if not, just put them in the parking lot, and let's get the ball moving here. Because, your phone going off a minute ago, that was actually me hacking into your phone from the microchip in my shoe.
Have a blast. Have fun. You'll see a lot of pictures of my kids, so...
I was going to say that one, you might want to...
Yeah. But make this link between what you're trying to accomplish and we saw about half acquisition, half government, half industry. What do these things mean for the government folks to start off?
Well, if you're a contracting officer, if you are a program manager, if you are involved in the acquisition life cycle in one way or another, and a requirement comes across your desk, particularly the contracting folks, but everybody has a role to play here, but particularly the contracting officer, you pick up the pen, you get ready to sign it, you have looked at that requirement, you have addressed whatever the proposals were, all the various sundry things that you have to do. Just take a moment to think about, does what I'm buying here connect to a network, or involve the transmission of data? And if it does, or could it, if it does or might, just make sure that that requiring activity, that finance office, that budget owner, that end user, most importantly, as Joe talked about, that risk owner, has signed off on two things. One, they understand the risk involved and that it's inherent to the item that's being purchased. And two, probably more importantly, they certify or sign off on in some way or another the fact that the mitigations or the management strategy for that risk that we are putting into this particular acquisition is sufficient based on the risk tolerance of that end user. So the example is, a printer, a network printer. Maybe not within a traditional definition of ICT. If I buy a network printer and I put it in the hallway at GSA, the risk presented by the network printer is the same as the risk that is presented by the network printer if I put it in the hallway at NSA. However, the risk tolerance at those two organizations is quite different. And so those two things, the inherent risk and the risk tolerance, are critical.
One of the things that we find both within departments, because you've got multiple agencies, therefore different missions, and we have a lot of suppliers who are looking at that. The standardized ways of the language that you put out, the security controls that you specify, it makes it easier if we kind of start having these templates where it's not a one-size-fits-all. It's about understanding that mission profile and your risk. Within the Department of Homeland Security, we now have, for our acquisition associated with the high sensitive systems, that there's requirements that the contracting officers now have to make sure on, even if the user didn't specify want that, here's the things that you've got to ask for as part of the IT acquisition review before you even put it out as an RFP.
Right.
I mean, it's just like, this is to make sure it's helping everybody understand what we've got to do in this space.
And in our covered systems, our national security systems at DoD, our intelligence community, we've been doing this stuff well. Reasonable minds can differ, I guess, about how well, but we've been doing it in some way, shape, or form for some time. The idea is, what parts of the cost of that very high assurance model can we peel back to make this a little bit more scalable, and yet retain some of the controls and things in there based on risk that provide the right level of assurance. And that's the balance. And so you asked where we're going. We're taking that taxonomy, once we agree on it, and defining categories. You can kind of think of strategic sourcing. It's a basic kind of sourcing principle. Look at your spend, divide it up into categories, and then define common practices. And in this case, common cybersecurity requirements for each category.
John, let me get John in here because I think he wanted to say something, right?
Well, I was just going to thank you for the vote of confidence about at the agency level, but I would say some agencies are doing it better than others, and I know when I started 2.5, 3 years ago, we weren't doing anything in this area, and so kind of down at the implementation level, it's difficult to implement the policies and the guidance that we're getting, implementing it down at the agency level and down at the individual contract level. And so, I'm trying to look at every IT-related procurement that goes through our agency. Okay, I'm trying to look at it for what are we buying and who are we buying it from? What's the risk associated with that? And so, kind of going back to your question for, what does a government person need to take from this session? Number one, I'd say, for contracting officers, contracting policy folks, for program managers, I mean, as Don said, this is kind of a new way of, we've got to think about this in a different way, in a fundamentally different way, and we've got to make that risk management decision. Program managers are used to making risk decisions about everything. This is another one, okay? But we need to get you the information that you can use to make those risk decisions. We need to get you information about the supply chain. Now that's either going to come, largely it's going to come from your contractors. And so I'll jump over to the contractors for you all. This is going to impact you all from the standpoint that the government is going to start, I'll say, raising the bar. If you look at Emile's document, that I think there's probably a half gallon of his blood and sweat in that document if you read between the lines. You know, one of the recommendations talks about establishing baseline cybersecurity requirements. Wow, what does that mean? What does that mean to contractors? What does that mean to contracting officers? What does that mean to program managers?
John, let me build on that.
Yeah.
So we'll just pause on that for a second. So baseline set of requirements. So like it or not, this is what DoD has done in November. I mentioned DFARS. So specific to the Department of Defense is we issued a DFARS in November, which has to do with organizations that either hold, store, or transmits unclassified technical information have to have certain requirements, NIST requirements on them. So what does that mean? If you're doing business with DoD on this contract, or if this DFARS is put on you, which the intent is it's going to be all technical work, your system now has to comply with certain requirements of NIST. That didn't exist before. As of November, that's now a new DFARS requirement. Also, if you get hacked, 72 hours, you have to report that. So now, geez, my network, I have to do, this is not DoD network, this is our network. Answer is, we just moved the cheese, everyone. We've just changed the paradigm. Now it's your networks in terms of this DFARS, in terms of what we are doing, the baseline set of requirements. This is DoD, I'm describing that DFARS, but as we look, you know, is this the lead indicator for all of the federal government? That is the baseline set of requirements that we are marching to.
You jump to the industry side, and I want to flesh out industry side more because that's half the people here. But go back to the government folks. What this DFARS is going to mean for the acquisition community? How are they going to do their work differently under this provision and the work that GSA is doing and DoD as well?
So maybe the best way to tease this is talk about a use case I'm involved in right now. A senator asked a question about a healthcare system that is a laboratory system for healthcare services. Like think about I go downtown to Burke Center where I have my medical treatment, laboratories, my doctors, whatever the case. Now, if I'm a service member, 60% of that is done off base. So we go to places like Burke Center where they do the medical, whatever the case may be. The question came in, this information that this private entity has, what requirements do we have on it? So the question actually came from the Hill. And it gets back to the point of if you are going to contract out, i.e. a service, like a medical treatment, I'm going to contract out to this facility to do healthcare or do laboratory services for it. This DFARS, or if DFARS like this, will be put on you. So lo and behold, it will be part of virtually all contracts as we go forward for a contracting officer, at least in the Department of Defense as we stand today.
John was saying that it's a challenge getting this through the organization and still getting folks to, because this is totally new, but not everyone takes it seriously. Are you going to get folks to take this seriously? How are you going to make sure that this happens?
Well, how we do it, and think about all these different organizations, program offices, wherever the case may be. The classic approach, and as we all know, in the world what we live in, is the federal acquisition regulations. Like it or not, it is the point to where you get to all those program offices, all those program managers, all those contracting officers, because if you do not do it in a FAR type of format, it's going to be hit and miss. So you got to put it in a federal acquisition regulation. So in essence, as Emile, and as we talk about the other 7 and RMF and all these other pieces of it, I believe the end point is changes to the federal acquisition regulation, which is really concerning because it's a zero-sum game. You put more on the table with cybersecurity. We're not in a budget that's increasing, we're in a budget that's decreasing, so guess what? Things are coming off the table, no question about it. So we have to be very, very smart in how we specify what should be put on the table, because we know capabilities can be dropped off, like you said.
You know, there's actually language in the FAR that already protects us in space, and the language is under non-conforming products. I mean, that's Does anyone here think that a counterfeit component is conforming? Does anyone think that a tainted product is conforming? We already have the law. It's on our side already, we're just not exercising it. And so just putting more things in there until we get an acquisition community that's helping enforce that, what's not as good. Actually, DoD's done something even better when you look at your 5200 series and the 8500 series. You've got a lot more explicit guidance in it than anyone else right now to implement the default.
Right, so let me just jump in there too, because there's a balance here, right? Nothing happens till there's a FAR clause. Nothing happens till a sale is made, right? Until you put it in the contract. Yes, I'm going to come and listen to you speak, and it's lovely. But am I going to invest in my own systems? Maybe I will. Maybe as an industry, stakeholder here, I'm looking at a particular market segment, and I know that they in particular. Maybe I'm looking at John, and the DIA requirements, and I know that I'm going to have to do this stuff. But maybe I'm looking at a federal strategic sourcing for printers. I don't know when that's going to happen. Emile just said it's a decent example, but that that connection to when that happens in a clause in the contract is kind of here or there. So absolutely, we're going to have some FAR changes. However, the other part of this that is challenging, it's complex, is the cyber threat is such that the minute you say, I'm going to now require these 18 or 63 or 500 controls in all my contracts, you've just told the bad guys where not to go. That's kind of what you brought up earlier. So we need to have, and the FAR, love it, sort of. I'll have to say that. But it is not the most agile, way to address things. And so
the understatement of the day has now been uttered.
And one of the things, you get reaction from people, especially on the supply side, well, that's going to increase the way, cost of me doing business and something like that. You actually benefit from a better informed customer. A customer who is asking for these things, it provides a level playing field for those who have been doing the right thing, so that you're not viewed as competing against Joe's garage shop who says he's got a really cheap product and the same thing. It's not doing all those other things. So it's actually better because we've got many of the organizations already doing it today. And they just want to say, reward us for having done the right thing. And people say, well, what's my incentive? It's called, you get a contract.
Joe, talk a little bit, and Don mentioned a little bit about essentially expanding the network. It is now not just DoD's network, it's much larger. Do you see that coming to the civilian side as well?
It is, and that's already happening. And like I said, we're already being asked to support others. And it is still an issue of a growing awareness, and that's why we're spending more effort on developing both the education and training material for contracting officers, procurement officers, and acquisition officials. So it's not overnight, but it's happening.
And Emile, talk a little bit about the implications for vendors, for contractors. They're going to see big changes coming too.
The government has to sort of get religion here and clean up its own side of the street, right? In a lot of cases. However, we're getting there, and you can help by, number one, engaging in these collaborative efforts that we have going on. I mean, I talked about a community problem and a shared problem. Well, the shared problem demands a shared solution. What we have in that set of recommendations that's in the report is not Emile's report and Don's report, or it's not a government report. It's a community report, because what's in there is really reflective of the best thought that we got through a highly collaborative process over the course of 4 months that pulled out, input from mom and pop providers, global corporations, subject matter experts in and outside of the government, in academia and elsewhere. And so that high level of collaboration, we are going to maintain that throughout implementation. And
I want to build upon what you're saying in terms of that piece. So when I think about this panel, I think about today, the question is okay, what can you all do? And here's for me the most important part of today, right now, which is we have recommendations, the best we can have developed. And now we're in the phase of writing the implementation plan, where we need your help. That is the plug, everyone. This is an advertisement right now. which is we certainly are not perfect in terms of how we're looking at this, because as we agree, the FAR, being on both sides of the fence is, the must-have, and you grind your teeth when you think about this. But at the end of the day, we certainly need your help as we develop the implementation plan. So we wrote, so in terms of a snapshot, the report was sent to the White House back in January, and the White House came back very quickly with some feedback. What was the feedback?
Good job.
Do it.
Now go do it.
And develop an implementation plan.
Yeah, and so that's our first.
So do you guys want to comment on what exactly should people do, or what is the process by which people can play a role and help with what you just talked about, Tom?
Go to go to the software and supply chain assurance forum. Go to the GSA and the DoD website, go to the Federal Register, and pull down the report, take a look at it, and pull down that request for comment, and take a look at that taxonomy, and look at the categories that we're using. Engage. It's really engage. Come to places like this, and talk to each other, talk to us, ask questions.
What's the timetable on the implementation plan? How quickly is this going to come?
We've got the request for comment is out until 28th April. That's the first in a series of sequential and concurrent requests for comment. This first one is really only dealing with 2/3 of the first recommendation to be implemented, which is a acquisition cyber risk strategy for the federal
And
government.
we should mention that it's not short.
It's a few pages.
Yeah. And apparently it's like out of Hogwarts, you had to write it in your blood or something.
Well,
There is one other thing that you could actually do to help, and as I mentioned earlier, NIST 800-161 special hub on, that deals with supply chain practices. There's a draft version 2 that's going to come out, it's going to hit the street in a couple weeks. Be on the look for that. And in particular, we're looking at the security controls that we're recommending, but in particular, Appendix G, which is a new part to it, deals with the supply chain risk management plan and how it's dealt. Where does it fit within the life cycle of engineering, development activities, acquisitions? So that would be very important to be able to comment on that.
Yeah, absolutely.
So yeah, because that wasn't the question that I was intending to ask when Chris handed me the microphone and dashed out of the room for everybody.
Never drink one of those juices before you moderate.
I think that's all.
Playing along in the home version of the game, there you go.
That's all we need to know about.
Yeah.
No, so the question I was going to ask actually was, so Emile, you were referring to the fact that this is not really going to be a one-size-fits-all solution. It has a lot to do with the risk tolerance of various agencies and various players. So what degree of standardization should we expect? Should we expect that every agency is going to come out with their own set of rules and regulations at the end of the day, or give us some insight into what degree you expect
I'll
that
give
to
you
be
the crystal ball.
Yeah, exactly. Well, let me see, it's, I mentioned a balance, and there's some art here. I think we can, for a category of procurement, and think about FedRAMP. Is everybody at least nominally familiar with FedRAMP? We took a category of procurement, cloud, and we said, for all cloud, any federal buyer must, include these things. For all cloud, any service provider that wants to sell to the federal government must do these things, must meet these particular controls. So that's in the parlance of NIST special publications called an overlay. And it basically takes, I don't know how many controls there are in 800-53, is it like 800?
500, yeah.
Okay, so there's lots. It takes that catalog of controls that is out there that's promulgated by NIST, that's collaboratively developed, that is, something that takes time. We're talking about the 161 overlay coming. And it parses out, gee, which ones of those controls are actually applicable to my cloud service provider. So that activity is kind of what we want to do across the board for different categories of procurement. Now, I don't want to suggest for a moment that we're going to have some peanut butter spread of 853 controls for each category that is applicable to all agencies. What we intend to do is distill out the highest common denominator. I think in some categories that's going to be 50% coverage, maybe others it'll be 80% coverage, and provide that as the minimum for an overlay. And then also identify in the overlay, what are the other controls that are relevant, that might be something that you, as a risk owner, want to include to do your procurement based on your own risk tolerance. So, you know, if we start talking about information about companies in the supply chain, some agencies might find it more interesting than others that, you know, your board of directors is funded by a foreign government. Some agencies may be able to use that in their procurement decisions, others will not. Those kinds of differences are going to be the things that don't make it into that minimum, into that baseline, right? Those would be in that sort of universe, that menu.
The security controls, I'll go back to the whole thing on supply chain risk management. We'd really like to see this so that truly is an engagement between industry and the acquiring organization. In fact, you'll find that many in the acquiring organization will say, you know, I just know that we're supposed to buy these things. I'm not sure what security controls to put in place. Maybe even the using organization isn't the right one. I would envision a pre-solicitation RFI going out. We're thinking about buying these things. You in industry who are suppliers, you could recommend, what do you think are the security controls that go in there? They get that, gel that with the using organization, and then the RFP goes out, having been informed by industry what are the applicable security controls, knowing this is the environment it's going to be deployed to. That's why I think that's the engagement between the two players.
Well, and let me
Yeah.
just jump in here, because that's one of the things that we found that kind of makes this hard at the implementation level, is that this is truly a conversation that has to happen between acquisition, you know, contracting and contracting policy folks. It has to happen between cybersecurity folks. It has to happen between, you know, in my business, counterintelligence folks. And so trying to pull all those conversations, industrial security folks, you know, then, God, we get the lawyers involved, and it's
great, we do such a great job of having all those people talk anyway, so it works
right. And
perfectly.
so, you know, what we're trying to do is, you know, one thing we found in terms of the 800-53 controls is that, you know, I see in our implementation space, we've got kind of two leverage points that I look at in terms of, number one, I've got contracting officers that have to sign the documents to say, yeah, you can go buy it. And then I've got certifiers and accreditors at the other end that have to implement those security controls and say, yeah, you're certified to operate. Those are kind of my two leverage points where I need to get to make sure that, number one, we've bought it up front, we've put in the right kinds of contracting language, we've worked with the contractors and all that kind of stuff. And then number two, on the back end, you know, before it gets deployed operationally, we've got the certifiers checking to make sure all those security controls. But there's a lot of work to do at both ends.
And there's one thing that, as we talk, you know, the more I hear, Rich, is if I was in the audience, I'd also be thinking of lots of requirements. Geez, thanks. But you have to realize something. One of the recommendations is increase accountability, which is not your voluntary, just like you do financial audits in your companies and your organizations. You also have to think about the voluntary pieces that you can do within your companies or organizations that will bolster your cybersecurity. I think it would help in proposals. I think you help your business case as you go forward. And by the way, no one's telling you to do it. I mean, so for all intents and purposes, you have to think of that too. Increase accountability across the industry. I mean, it's not just private, it's public, it's governments. It's all part of that, which is voluntary types of things.
Let me stick with you for 1 second, because I'm also hearing folks out there saying, hold on, as you mentioned earlier, the spend in government across the board is going down. There are even some makers of devices that have said to DoD, your business is very nice. This is a device you can buy.
Don't need it. Exactly.
They're saying go away,
exactly.
and yet, so you end up with a smaller group of folks who are going to do business with you, which sounds like costs go up. How does all this work in the other challenges, bringing more small businesses in, all those kinds of things?
And I know that I'd say it's a huge, you've got the ultimate question right there, which is to say,
Thank you very much.
and how do you address these different things? Because part of the answer is we certainly don't want to create thresholds where folks don't compete and we drive people away, the Googles and the innovative shops out there. We certainly are not in that business because years ago, IT was a big part, government was a big part of it. These days, government's a very small piece of the IT solution. We're not driving, it's the commercial sector that's driving it, and we're along for the ride for all intents and purposes. So you're spot on. Now the question here is, when we have a trusted environment, when we have that source, and we're operating in an environment where someone's not going through an HVAC to get information, credentials, and to drive things, then we have a more secure, trusted environment so we can do business in this time frame. And thus, the era. We're now in a new era. And I agree with you. We're going to balance this very carefully because we certainly can't drive the small companies or the commercial-focused companies where I previously worked away from the federal government. We certainly don't want to go there.
And actually, you just hit my question, with
Thank
small
you.
business
We're just-
and competition and everything like that, leveraging those type of requirements out of this, what was it, 853 and the new 161, right, on businesses because they're doing business with the government, small business, that's going to really drive down competition. It's going to get the numbers down lower and, like you said, I love it, but I don't love it, I live it. So it's going to be really difficult for industry to meet those things.
But you understand, and I've dealt with several who are in small businesses and say, I just don't have the infrastructure to do that. Just buy my product. Don't make me do all those things. I said, the problem is that product can put my entire enterprise at risk. And it's just like, yet that supplier is not sharing any liability with anything going wrong. And that's a problem space. By the way, I don't know how many of you got Android phones and stuff. You realize that some of you get a brand new one, it's got malware pre-installed. You have a Netflix app on it that it's counterfeit, that it's got malware on it. And so who provided that? Was it malicious? It was probably no, it was free. So I put it on there, extra feature. And that's the problem, is that nobody's checking that because it wasn't required. The consumer didn't even think it was going to be at risk.
So the government's got things in place to help small businesses, and they work with them, and to instill competition. With these requirements coming out, with the 161 coming out and everything, is the government, or is part of that being explored of how we're not going to affect competition with these requirements to where we can have that collaboration with industry and make sure that, we're maintaining security, but we're also maintaining competition?
Well,
You want me to jump on that?
you can, but I definitely have an opinion as well. Go ahead.
All right. So, in certain cases, cost of service is going to go up.
Yes, sir.
No doubt. One of the recommendations is actually...
Because agencies have all this extra money these days. So
Right.
we
don't.
don't.
But it's a total life cycle cost, not just the price to buy it.
Right.
What's it going to cost you?
Well, so, and that's what we look at. Like, it's not, and I don't even like the term life cycle because then I've got my acquisition life cycle. And once my acquisition life cycle is done, then I'm over. Now, what about my sustainment life cycle, my disposal life cycle? So, lifespan.
Lifespan, okay.
Again, terminology is a basic issue. One of the recommendations is that for certain high-risk types of acquisition, a mitigation that should be employed is to only buy, the government should only buy, from original manufacturers or authorized or franchise distributors, right? Trusted, bad word. Because we don't know, bad because we can't figure out what it means. Maybe over here, DOD, there's some trust.
There are procurement officials making a decision that says, oh, look, I can get that same product over here a lot cheaper. I'm going to save my organization money,
Well,
not knowing that it's counterfeit.
Right.
But because they didn't go through the check.
Or the reason it's cheaper.
There's organizations who would like to give it away for free. Say, hey, take this and install it on your network. But it's more likely.
So, and the reason that recommendation made it into the report is because when we went and asked industry, how do you address this? How do you address it? It applies to counterfeits and other issues as well. this is the common response. The emphatic response was, if you guys just buy from OEMs and authorized, you will handle some large portion of the problem.
Of the counterfeit.
Of the counterfeit problem.
Not necessarily the tainted.
Well, there's the rub, right?
Yeah.
You can have genuine malware. It's good. So what we did is then say to industry, okay, you got skin in the game here, you got brand value, you've got stock price, you got fiduciary duty, you have all the skin in the game. You also have, in some respects, a broader universe of opportunity to address these issues than the government does in certain circumstances. You have all the options in the world to how you're going to address this. And so why then do you choose to address it through this particular mechanism of authorized or OEM? And the response came back pretty clearly that, well, it comes down to those terms and conditions that we have our authorized distributors or resellers on the hook for when they become authorized. And same thing in our supply chain. We hold our suppliers to a higher standard because we have brand value in the stuff that comes out of our manufacturing plant. Okay, fine. Let's distill out the common denominator there, the highest common denominator. Because we've got, competition, see, that's a, pretty big deal in the federal procurement system. Small business, we're not going to get rid of Title 15. It's there for a reason. So let's distill out and understand from a government side, what are those terms and conditions? What are the common terms and conditions that give you, the manufacturer, the confidence to tell me as a customer, you should trust this particular channel? If you tell me it's those terms and conditions, let's have them. And then we will set up what we call a qualified bidders list, something that's already in the fall. And we need to manage that bidders list. The criteria for becoming, for getting on the list will be that highest common denominator of terms and conditions that are appropriate for the market segment that particular item is falling into.
John, I know you were trying to get in, so did we cover your point?
Yeah, I think, just like Emile said, that's the one thing that I've heard, time and time again from our vendors and suppliers is, man, if you just buy through authorized channels, you will alleviate, 7% of your.
In a software sense, how does all this work in a world where people they're not buying, shrink wrap software is, no one's seen that in a long time. You download everything and.
No, there's still evaluation services associated, even with proprietary COTS products, but there is still the issue of some things that are not proprietary that we've got access to. So there's all kinds of software, but how did you evaluate that? How did you make sure somebody looked at it? If it was even just internally within the organization, the supplier, what kind of processes do they have in place? That's where we start getting into the area of taints. Is it got malware, exploitable weaknesses, or vulnerabilities in it? Because there are technologies now, the tooling that's even better. There's techniques that are known. That's one of the things we've been sharing in our public-private collaboration. And there's many companies who've stepped up to that.
Hi, I'm sorry, I should have had people do this. Who are you?
No problem. Rick Jones, Cisco Systems. So thanks for the conversation.
And by the way, Edna was on our panel this morning.
Yeah, I know Edna.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Who's Edna, by the way?
Edna Conway. She's our Chief Security Officer.
Oh, there you go.
At Cisco.
So my question about this is, will these cybersecurity requirements, will they all the way down to the level of these LPTA competitions, where there's one of the banes of that whole process is poorly written requirements that open Pandora's box. And I'm wondering if these cyber requirements are going to get down to that level where contracting officers have to include minimally technically acceptable cyber requirements for bids, which when you say raise the bar, that's what it does. It really stops the race to the bottom.
And by the way, that's what
We don't have great written requirements as it is, and we're adding additional stuff.
Is that requirement, as far as the competition between lowest price and, because they say technically acceptable, well, if it's counterfeit, is it really technically acceptable, is the question. And I don't have to tell you that most people don't understand this, that the vast majority of counterfeits that are actually discovered is because our organizations have returned what we thought were defective products back to the OEM or OCM, said, hey, your product's defective, and they said, it's not ours. Oh, but it's got your brand on it. It's not ours.
I can't tell you how many of those calls we have fielded.
Yeah, you get a lot of that.
So that goes,
So,
I think that goes back to the certified OEM.
It absolutely does. So the overlays that I talked about, so you have a category of procurement, maybe it's network gear, right? For all network gear, we're now going to require these, umpty-ump controls out of 53. We're going to also have in that overlay procurement controls. I say controls, and it's automatically evaluated in terms of people get into the NIST guidance, but source selection criteria, source selection evaluation methodology, pricing methodology, when to or not to use LPTA. Two things came out of industry lab, the OEM and authorized and LPTA, and that's not news, but it's something we have to address, because the problem with LPTA, it's fine. It's not a problem with LPTA, it's just that we don't really define the TA part of it.
Yeah, well, and let me jump in, because one of the
lowest price technically.
Oh, sorry.
one of the things we're trying to, this kind of goes back to what Emile was saying about overlays and how you define requirements for different situations. I'm trying to put this in terms of the kinds of things that we're buying and the kinds of contracts that we're using. So in other words, sometimes we go out with, basically commodity purchases of IT stuff, okay? And some of that is through WGSA or the NASA SUB or one of those big contract vehicles. And so sometimes it's a FAR Part 12 commercial item kind of thing. And so that's kind of one class of acquisition where there's not a whole lot of say, special contract requirements that our contractor folks want to throw in there, okay? Because, or can. So, and then there's another class that I think of in terms of, prime and systems integrator kinds of contracts that, where you have a full-blown RFP, and we just put one out on the street, eSite, a couple of days ago, and that for the first time has got some supply chain risk management requirements in there as part of the RFP, as part of the statement of work.
Which is a huge deal, by the way.
And I'll go back to Emile's buzzword, imperfect, okay? That's probably, it's probably about a 50 to 60% solution in terms of what kinds of supply chain risk management requirements ought to be in a big contract like that. But that's the best I had going in. So it's in there. It's and I didn't get much feedback in the draft RFP stage, which either meant nobody read it or they read it and they didn't get it. Right. Or some of the things that I've heard from industry and when we've talked to them is that we do a lot of this stuff already. We do most of this stuff. We have programs, like Emile was saying, we have skin in the game. This is our IP, this is our brand protection, this is our reputation that we're trying to protect. So it's almost like, hey government, you guys get on board, because what we're tired of is we're tired of offering you this additional protection and then you go in with the lowest bidder that doesn't have that protection.
Which is where they turn to the gray market, and we understand. And DoD's got this big time, because having retired from the Air Force, I'll say DoD has a lot of legacy systems, in which in some cases the OEM, OCM no longer exist, and you have to go out and repair something. You're out on the gray market. That's just standard business for some of the guys in the sustainment world. So again, but what do you do to vet those things? And
What kind of business due diligence can we do?
Right. On the acquisition side, what do you do to check things? Because quite frankly, when you're in a maintenance mode, people go out and say, I need to find a form-fit replacement, this chip. And it comes back within weeks. Something that's not out there, but it comes back within weeks. The same form, same fit, function. Oh yeah. Did anybody ever check to see if it does anything else? Does anybody check? Now that's a maintenance function. We don't do that. And we recognize that that's a challenge space. The gray market is going to be with us as long as we've got legacy systems.
Maybe it's tying into this morning, Katrina McFarland, we heard from her this morning in the piece. She also, a couple months ago, issued an edict to us and the staff For all intents and purposes, she wanted a guidebook to help a program manager implement cybersecurity. and addressing the entire life cycle, not just the acquisition piece, but particularly that of the sustainment piece. Because, again, it's all about the people. It's all about the skill sets of those people putting solicitations out, be it small products, be it enhancements, or a new acquisition, per se. So this is what we've done in DoD, is we've developed a guidebook at Katrina's direction to help those program managers and those contracting officers go off and implement cybersecurity. Again, is this the model? I don't know, but this is what we've done in DoD.
But we ought to share that with everybody, right?
Absolutely.
And that's something that all agencies could benefit. You can kind of pick and choose, but start with something to choose from rather than a blank sheet of paper. And some agencies.
So when you get a couple last questions.
Hi,
Who are you?
I'm Mike McHugh, I'm from General Dynamics Recognition Technology. I have a question about...
Speaking of it, a small 8A, we were hoping you're going to grow out of it anyway.
Well, my question has to do with the philosophy of security and how someone made a critical observation that you don't hear very often, that you cannot buy perfect security, right? You cannot get there. So, given all these new recommendations and standards, has anybody done an assessment of what's the butcher's bill to the taxpayer, to the treasury, for what this is going to cost, either nominally or as a percentage of the overall IT investment?
And I think the short answer is you don't have a complete story on that. And in particular, because too often they look at just what's it going to cost me to buy it. And as we've talked about, you've got this entire life of the enterprise that you're supporting to do that. So if you only do a time and space and say, oh, it's going to be more expensive right here. But over this, we've been spending a whole lot on the ops and sustainment side of the house that we shouldn't have been because we didn't pay attention to it during the acquisition procurement. I mean, and that's, we know that. You can say, is it only anecdotal? No, we've got examples within organizations because I had to spend a whole lot of money that I didn't have in ops and sustainment, but they didn't buy it correctly.
I think Target could have fixed that gap in the HVAC system stuff for about a couple $100,000. And it's somewhere, it's definitely 7 figures that it's costing them.
And thus the CIO is gone.
Yeah.
And back to accountability, that's the history.
One last question? Somebody want it? If you ask it, oh, good, I'll give you a drink. I'll go buy you a special drink.
I was just wondering if that book that you wrote, DoD, is it available? Is it available to other DoD customers, other agencies?
It is, and I got a caveat. It's I shouldn't say work in progress. We have brought it to her and told to go back and keep working it. So very much like the report. The report is actually written a long time ago. It just got published in January. So needless to say, the answer is absolutely yes. The intent is not very shared. In fact, I would espouse the point that we're on this together across the federal government, and that we should be thinking this guidebook is something we build upon and use across different agencies. Maybe have a repository of sorts, so that we can share and use. Because again, this is kind of new ground for all of us. The answer is yes. The intent is yes. Absolutely.
The intent is yes, or people can get it now?
They can't get it now because it's still draft.
Right.
She hasn't blessed it, so it's still working.
DHS has the ITAR, the other ITAR.
Yeah, the other. It's the we have an IT acquisition review process, and we're putting that out. Some of that's internal use, being able to do that. But we are sharing that, and we're trying to incorporate that into the training of our acquisition professionals.
And just so I'm on her question, where would folks watch to see when this gets posted?
Well, so this is all part of the implementation plan as we go forward, because I think we should be thinking non-agency specific as we go through the cybersecurity piece. I think we should be thinking of a common portal, and that's part of our implementation plan. I think we have to develop, because for all intents and purposes, the report was published in January. We're in the implementation drafting phase. I think this is part of our implementation plan, which is something for everyone across agencies to be able to look at. So the answer to your question is that's a really good question. I don't have the answer to your question, which is, we have a portal, are we going to publish it? I would expect the answer is yes. I would expect
Twitter feed.
Yeah.
Send it to me, I'll make sure it gets up. Let me wrap up by asking each of you to leave folks with a thought that they should be taking out with them. This is a changing world. What do you hope they walk out of there remembering? John?
Don't drink that stuff.
But sold a lot of these Evolution Fresh drinks.
But I mean, hopefully you take away just, nothing else, a little bit better understanding and appreciation for the overall environment, you know, the idea that there's a lot of stuff swirling around here. There's legislation, there's policy, there's guidance at the agency level. There's going to either be or need to be guidance at the agency level. And so, you know, this is largely going to affect the contracting folks, the contracting officers, the contracting policy folks, and the program managers. You know, as a risk management exercise that, you know, it's not going to be perfect, and you're never going to be able to drive risk to zero, you know, but you've got to make a conscious risk management decision when you're looking at, you know, purchases, you know, for cybersecurity for IT systems.
Joe?
Don't think of being a victim. Too often people are just thinking, I have my job, I just have to do this, I can't possibly control anything that the suppliers are bringing me, that I'm just doing this and I'm passing it on. If you really take an understanding of what the need is, you're going to have tools in place such as the NIST 800 series. You're going to have things, because even when you become the evangelist within your organization, there are others going to say, show me who else is doing this, where else is that. So you're going to have these resources to point to. And by the way, I put our websites on there. This is where you can get some of the resources. Our software and supply chain assurance, community resource information clearinghouse, and our build security in website. Lots of resources, community developed to be able to do that. The key is we can actually make a difference to government procurement to change the face of the cyber resiliency of our enterprises. You actually have a critical role in that. Working with the suppliers who actually enable that, and that's where it's the conversation. We have to do that. And please don't expect one size fits all to come out. That won't work for it. There's a lot of good things coming out. Just within the next few months, you're going to see things come out that will actually help you do your jobs better. There are things already there, and do that more.
And I know a couple people will ask, I understand, we're just about done. They're coming in and it's going, you'll send me, and we'll get them posted so people can find these easy, and I'll tweet those out too, so. Emile.
Hell! Well, a little facetious there, but yeah, engage. Help us figure this out. Community problem demands a shared solution. You know, we're going to get to good if we all help out. The other is for our acquisition folks, just take that moment, take that pause, and step back from what it is that you're buying in your particular instance, and just ask yourself, does it connect to a network? Does it involve the transmission or use of data? And if it does, let me just talk to my information security people, let me talk to my program management people, and make sure that they've built the right stuff in.
Don, you're in charge. Bring it all home.
Well, this has been quite a pleasure. This has been quite a great opportunity, and thank you. I guess for all of us, I guess the big takeaway is that none of us can put our head in the sand and think this is not going to apply to you, and this is yet another government initiative that we're going to go spend and have massive bureaucracy. The fact of the matter is it's going to impact every one of you, every one of your contracts, every one of your solicitations, even your IT network. So for all intents and purposes, back to the help piece, you have an opportunity also to participate. And I encourage you to participate.
As I mentioned, I put all of Emile's stuff and all the stuff, and I'll get these other links up there as well, so you can find the information all nice and easy. I hope you'll join me. Lots of change going on. I hope you join me. And thank you, John and Joe and Emile and Don. Awesome job. Thank you very much.